My father had 11 days left, and my sister still hadn't visited. That's the sentence I kept turning over in the hospital parking lot at 11 at night, sitting in my car with the engine off, too angry to go back inside, and too exhausted to drive home. Renata lived 4 hours away. For hours. I had been sleeping in a vinyl recliner beside his bed for 2 weeks straight, memorizing the rhythm of the monitors, learning to wake at the exact pitch change that meant a nurse needed to be called, and my own sister couldn't manage a single Saturday. I had no idea, gripping that steering wheel in the dark parking lot with the radio off and the windows fogging, that the story I had been telling myself about her, cold, absent, too consumed by her own life to make room for family, was about to collapse completely, and that the truth underneath it would leave me ashamed of every clipped, angry text message I had sent her that month. This is the story of the 11 days before my father died, the phone call that upended everything I believed about my sister and the quiet, invisible sacrifice she had been carrying alone for 5 months rather than let me see it. Our father, Walton Ames, had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 8 months earlier, the kind of diagnosis that doesn't arrive as a single dramatic blow, but as a slow, grinding erosion, a body negotiating its own exit in installments. There were good weeks, when he could still putter around his small garden and complain about the neighbor's dog getting into his tomatoes, and there were bad weeks, when climbing the stairs to his bedroom left him gray and breathless, gripping the banister like a man crossing something far more treacherous than 12 wooden steps. Each hospital stay, when they came, arrived a little more frequently and lasted a little longer than the one before it, an unmistakable pattern that none of us said out loud, but all of us understood. I was the one who took him to his cardiology appointments, who sat in the small, overheated waiting room memorizing the names of medications I couldn't pronounce the first time I read them, who learned to recognize the specific tightness in his voice that meant he was in more pain than he was willing to admit. I was the one who sat with him during the long, quiet afternoons when the television played reruns neither of us was really watching, both of us simply grateful for the noise filling a room that otherwise felt too heavy with everything neither of us wanted to say aloud. Renata called sometimes. She sent flowers once, a large, expensive arrangement that arrived at his house with a card that just said, "Thinking of you, Dad. Love, Renata." And I remember looking at that card and feeling something close to contempt. Thinking, flowers don't sit with him during a bad night. Flowers don't hold his hand in the emergency room. Every time I asked her, gently at first and then not gently at all, when she was coming to see him, she gave me some version of the same answer, delivered in a tone I had started to interpret as evasion. "I can't right now, Delaware. I'm sorry. Work's been impossible." I stopped believing the apologies somewhere around month 5, when the accumulated weight of 5 months of near-daily caregiving had worn my patience down to something thin and brittle, and every unanswered request started to feel like confirmation of something I had already decided was true. My sister had left home at 19 and built a life somewhere else, and somewhere in that life, I had quietly concluded, she had also let go of us. Renata and I had never been close in the particular way people mean when they use that word. Not enemies. Not distant in any dramatic or wounded sense. Just two people who had grown up under the same roof and ended up somewhere in our 20s, living lives that ran on almost entirely separate tracks. She left for the city right after high school, chasing a design career that had, from the outside at least, worked out for her. A steady stream of freelance clients, an apartment in a neighborhood I couldn't have afforded, social media photos of gallery openings, and restaurant dinners that made my own quiet, small-town life feel, on my worst days, a little smaller by comparison. I had stayed close to home, closer to our aging parents, closer to the version of family life that meant showing up in person rather than sending flowers and phone calls. I told myself, in my less charitable moments, that Renata had simply decided our family wasn't worth a 4-hour drive anymore, that whatever life she'd built in the city had become more important to her than the one she'd left behind. I had absolutely no idea how completely, how devastatingly wrong that particular story actually was. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening, 10 days before my father's final hospital admission, from a woman named Priscilla Boone, a hospice care coordinator whose name I did not recognize at all. She asked, in the careful, practiced tone of someone accustomed to delivering both routine and difficult information, whether I was Delphine Ames, Walton's daughter. I said yes, cautiously, my stomach already tightening with particular dread that comes from unfamiliar numbers calling about people you love. I'm calling to confirm the payment authorization for next month's home aid hours, she said. Your sister asked me to reach out directly, since she's been a little difficult to reach by phone lately. I sat very still on the edge of my bed. I'm sorry. Payment authorization for what exactly? There was a pause on the line, the specific, uncomfortable pause of someone realizing mid-sentence that they have stepped into information they were not supposed to be the one delivering. The in-home aid services. Priscilla said carefully, clearly choosing her next words with more caution than her opening ones. Renata has been covering the 8 hours privately since March, 16 hours a week. I just needed to confirm the card on file before next month's billing cycle renews automatically. I had no idea, sitting frozen on the edge of my own bed with the phone pressed hard against my ear, that my father had been receiving 16 hours of paid in-home aid support every single week since March, help with bathing, medication management, the exhausting daily tasks. I had simply assumed our modest family savings and his basic Medicare coverage were somehow, barely, stretching to cover on their own. I didn't know about any of this, I said slowly, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. I need you to explain what you mean, please. Priscilla, to her considerable credit, didn't pretend she hadn't already said too much. She told me, carefully and with a kind of gentle honesty that I would later be grateful for, that Renata had set up private aid coverage through the agency back in early March, paid entirely out of pocket, and had specifically requested, more than once, that the arrangement not be mentioned to other family members unless it became somehow necessary. She said Renata had been very clear about that particular instruction, not unless it becomes necessary. She said it like a phrase she repeated back to herself more than once. Try to understand exactly what threshold would ever have counted as necessary enough. I hung up the phone and sat on my kitchen floor for a long time afterward, my back against the cabinets, staring at nothing in particular. The math began arranging itself slowly in my mind, the way real understanding sometimes does, not as a single dramatic revelation, but as pieces sliding quietly into place, one after another, each one changing the shape of everything around it. My father's insurance covered nursing visits twice a week, and almost nothing else beyond that. I had assumed, without ever quite examining the assumption closely enough to notice how flimsy it actually was, that his modest pension and Social Security check were somehow stretching to cover the rest. The aide who helped him shower safely on the days I couldn't be there myself. The additional physical therapy sessions that had started appearing on his calendar back in the spring, without my having arranged any of them, the adjustable hospital bed that had shown up in his living room in April, which I had simply been grateful for at the time without ever asking too many questions about where exactly it had come from or who had paid for it. I had absolutely no idea that all of it, every single piece of support I had been quietly, gratefully assuming was simply working itself out through some combination of insurance and savings, had actually been my sister, for hours away, paying for it herself month after month, and specifically asking a stranger not to tell me. I called her that night. She didn't pick up. I called again the next morning before work, and again that evening, and finally, on the third day, she answered, her voice carrying a tiredness I hadn't fully registered in months of phone calls I had, in retrospect, mostly spent being irritated rather than actually listening. Renata, I said, my voice tighter than I intended, I got a call from a woman named Priscilla Boone at the hospice agency. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I understood, immediately and with a sinking certainty, that this was not going to be a conversation where she brushed the whole thing off with a vague, deflecting explanation the way she had so many times before. She wasn't supposed to say anything to you, Renata finally said, her voice quiet. Why not? Why wouldn't you tell me you've been paying for Dad's home care for 5 months? Renata, 5 months. Do you understand what I've been thinking about you this whole time? Another long pause. When she finally spoke again, her voice had a particular flatness of someone repeating an explanation she had rehearsed many times inside her own head and was only now, reluctantly, saying out loud to another person for the first time. Because you already do so much, Delaware. You're there every single day. You know his medications by heart. You sit with him for hours. You drive him to every appointment and hold his hand in every waiting room. I can't do any of that. I live 4 hours away, and I have a job that doesn't let me just disappear for a week at a time whenever I want to. The only thing I actually had to offer was money, and I didn't want you thinking that was some kind of, I don't know, some kind of buying my way out of showing up in person. I didn't want you resenting me for it on top of everything else you were already carrying. I had absolutely no idea, until that exact moment, sitting on my kitchen floor with my knees pulled up to my chest, how completely I had already been resenting her for something entirely different than the truth, for not showing up in person, for not calling enough, for what I had quietly decided, without ever once asking her directly, was simple indifference dressed up as a busy life in the city. I had spent 5 months constructing an entire narrative about my own sister, brick by brick, out of nothing but silence and my own exhaustion, and the narrative had been wrong in almost every single particular that mattered. How much have you been spending? I asked quietly, bracing myself. She told me the number, and it was larger than I had expected. Considerably larger, the kind of figure that immediately explained, once I heard out loud, exactly why she had mentioned twice over the summer, almost in passing, that she was picking up extra freelance design contracts on the weekends. It explained why she'd stopped posting the small spring vacation photos she used to share every year around this time. It explained why the version of Renata I had been privately judging as absent and self-absorbed, had actually been working 2 jobs in a city 4 hours away, night after night, in order to keep our father comfortable and safe in a house she almost never got the chance to visit herself. You should have told me, I said, and I could hear my own voice cracking around the edges, all the anger draining out of it and leaving something raw underneath. I've been so angry at you. Renata, I've told people you don't care. I told Marcus. I told Aunt Fenwick. I even told Dad's neighbor Trudy that you checked out of this family. I said those words out loud about you. I know, she said softly. I could hear it in your texts, even the short ones. I almost told you a dozen different times. I didn't know how to explain it without it sounding like I was asking for credit or like I was trying to compete with everything you were already doing by throwing money at the problem instead. What you're doing every day is harder than writing a check once a month, Delaware. I know that. I really do know that. I didn't want you to think, even for a second, that I believed a checkbook made up for not being physically present. I sat with that admission for a long moment, understanding slowly, painfully, that we had each been carrying separate, invisible versions of the same guilt. Mine about not doing enough emotionally to reach her, hers about not doing enough physically to be present, and that neither of us had said any of it out loud until a hospice coordinator's misplaced phone call had finally cracked the whole thing open. Come see him, I finally said, not because you owe it to me, because I think you need to, and I think he needs to see you too before I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. I'll be there Saturday, she said. I promise. I had no idea, hanging up that phone, exactly how much that single Saturday visit was about to reshape the final days I left with my father, or how much I still had left to understand about my sister before those 11 days ran out. Renata arrived on Saturday morning, and I watched her walk into that hospital room with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since we were children. Something raw and unguarded that the version of her I'd built in my head over the past 5 months had never once accounted for. She sat beside our father's bed and took his hand, and he looked at her for a long moment before his face broke into the kind of smile I hadn't seen from him in weeks. There's my girl, he said, his voice thin but clear. I wonder when you get tired of me. Never, Renata said, and her voice broke on the word. I stood in the doorway and watched them, and I felt something in my chest that was equal parts relief and shame. Relief that this reunion was finally happening, and shame how close I had come to losing 5 months of my relationship with my sister over a story I had never actually bothered to verify. Over the following days, before Dad's condition worsened to the point where visitors became difficult, Renata came every weekend, driving the 4 hours up on Friday nights and back on Sunday afternoons, splitting the exhausting, unglamorous work of bedside caregiving between us in a way that felt, for the first time in years, like we were actually sisters again rather than 2 people connected only by shared history and obligatory phone calls. I learned, in fragments over those weekends, exactly how much she'd sacrificed to keep that aid coverage running. the vacation days cashed out, the freelance contract she'd taken on nights and weekends, the modest apartment she'd stayed in for 2 extra years instead of moving somewhere nicer, because the difference in rent was going, instead, toward 16 hours a week of someone helping our father get through his days with dignity. Why do you just ask me to help pay for it? I asked her one evening. The two of us sitting in the hospital cafeteria over bad coffee, our father finally asleep upstairs. Because you were already giving everything you had just by being there, she said. I didn't have that to give. This was the only thing I actually could give, and it felt like it needed to be enough on its own, without me also asking you for money on top of your time. I think some part of me needed it to be enough. Delaware. I needed to know I was actually doing something real for him, not just performing concern from 4 hours away. I understood, hearing that, something I probably should have understood much earlier, that we had each, in our own separate and largely silent ways, been terrified of being seen as a sibling who wasn't doing enough, and that fear had kept us from simply telling each other the truth about what we were each actually carrying. Our father passed away 9 days after that phone call from Priscilla Boone, with both of us in the room, Renata holding one of his hands and me holding the other, and in the quiet that followed, I found myself grateful, in a strange and complicated way, for the misplaced phone call that had forced the truth into the open before it was too late for either of us to understand it. At the funeral, when people asked Renata how she'd managed to be so present during his final months given how far away she lived, I watched her deflect the question the way she always had, some modest, self-effacing answer about just doing what family does. I finally spoke up in front of the small cluster of our father's old friends and told them what she'd actually done. The 8 hours, the freelance work taken on nights and weekends, the sacrifices made quietly and without any expectation of recognition. Renata's face went red. You didn't have to say that, she murmured afterward. Yes, I did, I said. You spent 5 months letting me believe you didn't care, because you didn't want credit for something you thought should just be quiet and automatic. I'm done letting you carry that alone. And I'm done assuming the worst about people I love just because I don't have the full story yet. That, I think, was the real lesson buried inside those 11 days. Not that money can fix grief, or that a single phone call can undo months of misunderstanding on its own, but that the stories we tell ourselves about the people we love, especially in the exhausting, depleted moments when we're running on too little sleep and too much fear, are rarely the whole truth. Renata hadn't been absent. She'd been present in the one way that was actually available to her, quietly, without asking for anything in return, while I filled in the silence around her with the worst possible explanation, simply because it was the only one I had access to. We talk every week now, Renata and I, real conversations rather than obligatory check-ins. And last spring, nearly a year after our father passed, she finally took the vacation she'd been postponing for 2 years, a full week somewhere warm. The first real rest she'd allowed herself since March of the year before. She sent me a photograph from the beach with a caption that just said, "Dad would have liked this." I think he would have. I think he'd have liked, even more, knowing that his daughters finally learned to ask each other the harder questions instead of quietly assuming the worst. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear in the comments. Have you ever completely misjudged what someone you love was actually carrying? Subscribe if you like more stories like this one about the quiet, complicated truths inside ordinary families.